Picture a long dinner table lit by candles, silver rattling with laughter. A duke hands her the deed to a collapsed hermitage for 1 shilling. The room roars with laughter. Selina says nothing at all. But that ruin had a last tenant who kept a record. What would you do if the people who were supposed to shelter you handed you a ruin instead and made you pay for the privilege of being humiliated? Selina Marsh stood at dawn before the collapsed hermitage with the answer already forming in her fist. The shilling was still there. She had not put it down since the night before, when the Duke's guest had laughed until the candle flames trembled, and she had walked the 3 miles back to the inn in the dark with the coin biting into her palm. It had left a mark, a small pale crescent pressed into the soft of her hand, the shape of a moon that would not rise. She opened her fingers now and looked at it, and then she looked at the thing she owned. Ferngarth Hermitage. That was the name written on the deed in the solicitor's careful copperplate, though nobody in the county had called it anything but the folly in a lifetime. It sat in a clearing of dripping oak and holly, and it was less a building than a suggestion of one. The roof had fallen inward on the eastern side, so that the ridge sagged like the spine of a starved horse. Ivy had got into the mortar and pried it open, patient as water. Where windows had been, there were only dark holes stuffed with the nests of things that had long since flown. A single wall stood square and true, and everything else leaned toward it as if for warmth. She had paid 1 shilling for it, and a joke, the Duke had said, is always funnier when it costs the fool something. Settle in, and let me take you back to the wet green fells of Cumberland, in the year 1815, to a village called Nethergill, where the rain comes sideways, and a stranger is an event that lasts a week. This is a story about a ruin, and a joke, and a man who kept a record. Before we go on, I would like to know where you are watching from tonight, so leave a word in the comments and tell me what weather is at your window. 2 years before that dinner, Selina Marsh had been nobody's fool and nobody's charity. She had been the granddaughter of an apothecary's widow in a market town in the flat green of Cheshire, and she had grown up in a shop that smelled of dried angelica and beeswax and the sharp green bruise of crushed leaves. Her grandmother had taught her the way other women taught their granddaughters to sew. She learned to read a receipt for a salve and to know when it lied. She learned to test a soil by wetting it and rolling it between finger and thumb, to feel whether it would hold clay or run to sand. She learned to rule a ledger in straight columns and to keep a reckoning that balanced to the last farthing, because her grandmother said that a woman who could not count would be counted against. Those were not accomplishments a lady was meant to have. No pianoforte, no watercolors, no French. When the old woman died and the shop went to pay the old woman's debts, Selina found that the world had no column for what she knew. She could judge mortar and she could dose a fever, and none of it was worth a character reference. So she went into service as a lady's companion, which is to say she was paid a little to be pleasant to someone who was not, and she was passed from one cold house to another until she came, at last, to be companion to the Duke of Harrowdene's widowed sister at Harrowdene Hall. She was dismissed from that place for the crime of being noticed. The sister had taken a chill, and Selina had brewed her a draught of white willow and elderflower that broke the fever in a night, and the physician who arrived the next morning to find himself unnecessary had complained that a servant had meddled with medicine. That was enough. A companion who could heal was a companion who thought too well of herself. But the Duke, when he heard the tale, found it entertaining, and that was how she came to be at his table on the night of the joke, seated below the salt among people who had been told, in advance, to enjoy what was coming. Augustus Thorne rose in his bottle-green coat with the gold waistcoat straining over him, and he rested one hand on his ebony cane, and he presented her with a folded deed as though it were a diamond. "Every kingdom needs a hermit, Miss Marsh," he had said, and the ruddy flush of the wine was high in his cheeks. "And every ruin needs a fool to live in it. I can spare you the ruin. You bring the rest yourself." The room roared. Selina had looked at the deed, and then she had looked at him, and she had said nothing at all. She had learned that silence was the one thing she owned that could not be taken from her, and she had learned, too, that a silence held long enough will unsettle a man more than any answer, because he cannot tell what is inside it. The Duke's smile had faltered for just a moment before he covered it with his glass. She had reached across and taken the deed, and she had counted out 1 shilling from her thin purse and set it on the cloth beside his plate, and she had thanked him for the gift in a voice so level that 2 people near her stopped laughing. She could have wept in the inn that night. She could have caught the carrier's cart in the morning and gone off to throw herself on the mercy of a cousin in Kendal who did not want her. Instead, she lay awake and thought about the folded deed and about the fact that she had never in her life owned anything at all, not a room, not a chair, not a square yard of England. And here, for a shilling and an insult, she owned a house. It did not matter that the house was a ruin. A ruin was still 4 walls that were hers, and she had spent her whole life being kept in rooms that belonged to other people. So in the gray before sunrise, she had walked out to look at it, and now she stood in the wet clearing with the crescent moon pressed into her palm, and she made her decision the way she made all her decisions, quietly and without telling anyone. She would not beg. She would go and claim the thing they had given her to break her, and she would live in it out of pure stubbornness, and she would see what a shilling had bought. She took up her single trunk from where the carter had left it at the edge of the wood, roped it onto her back the way she had seen field women carry, and she walked the neglected lane down into Nethergill with the holly dripping on her shoulders. The village saw her come. She felt it more than saw it, the small movements of lace curtains at low windows, the pause of a woman at a pump, the way 2 men outside the smithy stopped their talk to watch her pass. A stranger and a woman and alone, and carrying her own trunk like a tinker. She kept her gray eyes forward and her back straight, and she gave them nothing to feed on but the sight of her walking. The rain came on properly as she reached the village street, the kind of Cumberland rain that does not fall so much as stand in the air and soak upward from the ground at the same time. It found the gap at her collar and ran down between her shoulder blades. The street smelled of wet wool and coal smoke and the sour warmth of a byre, and somewhere a dog was barking itself hoarse at the weather. She stopped at the little shop with its bottle glass window and went in, dripping, to ask the way to Ferngarth and to buy a loaf and a twist of tea if her purse would stretch. The shopkeeper was a narrow man with a clean apron, and he knew who she was before she opened her mouth. Word of the Duke's dinner had come down the hill faster than she had. He weighed her half-loaf and took her coins and answered her question about the lane in as few words as he could manage, and the whole time he looked at a point just past her left ear, as though meeting her eyes might oblige him to something. When she thanked him, he gave a short nod and turned away to the shelves, and she understood that she had been served but not welcomed, and that the 2 were different things. Outside, an old woman had stopped in the rain to watch her, bent almost double over a knobbed blackthorn stick, wrapped in so many layers of black and gray wool that she seemed less a person than a heap of shadows with a face. The face was sharp and hollow-cheeked and very old, and the pale blue eyes in it were clouded but not blind. Selina inclined her head because her grandmother had taught her that the old are owed a greeting whatever the weather, and the old woman's mouth moved, but no sound came that Selina could catch over the rain. She went on. She did not yet know that the woman's name was Bet Crozier, or that she would want to have heard. The lane up to the Hermitage climbed out of the village and into the trees, and it had not been mended in the memory of anyone living. The ruts were rivers now. Bramble had grown across it in loops that snatched at her skirts, and twice she had to stop and unhook herself with cold fingers while the trunk dragged at her shoulders. The oaks closed over her head, and the light went green and dim. She could hear water everywhere, running off the fell and finding its way down through the wood in 100 small voices, and under that sound was a silence that was older and did not move. Then the trees opened and the ruin was in front of her, and she saw it truly for the first time. It stood against a bruised and sagging sky, and every line of it spoke of a thing that had once been cared for and then abandoned. She could read a building the way she read soil. She could see, under the collapse, that this had been made with intention, that someone had chosen the stone and set the door to face the morning, and carved a little round window like an eye above the lintel. And she could see that all of it had been left to the weather for longer than she had been alive. The fallen roof was its broken back. The empty window holes were its sockets. The one standing wall held its face to her, blind and patient, and the ivy moved on it in the wind as though it breathed. It was not a house, it was a ghost. Something moved at the edge of the clearing, low and quick, and she turned with her heart in her throat. It was a dog, a thin black and white thing with its ribs showing through a coat matted by rain, one ear up and one ear folded, watching her with the wariness of an animal that has learned that people mostly throw stones. It did not come to her and it did not run. It simply sat down at a careful distance under a holly bush and watched her, as if it too owned a share in the ruin and was curious to see what she meant to do with hers. "Well," Selina said, and her own voice sounded strange to her after so long walking silent. "You're a scrap of a thing." The name stuck to it the moment she said it. Scrap. She set down her trunk in the driest corner she could find, which was under the lee of the one good wall where a fragment of ceiling still held, and she did not try to conquer the house that first day, because she was not a fool and the house was too big a thing to conquer. She did what her grandmother would have done. She chose one small square of floor, no bigger than a bed, and she swept it. She swept the fallen leaves and the plaster crumbs and the mouse dirt and the years out of that one square yard until the flagstones showed gray and clean, and while she swept, she looked at the walls the way she had been taught, and she pressed her thumb into the mortar between the stones of the standing wall and found, to her surprise, that it was sound. Lime mortar, well slaked, still gripping after 50 years. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. A ruin built well is a different thing from a ruin built badly. One is dying and one is only sleeping. She gathered fallen wood that was dry enough under the holly, and she built a small fire in the corner of the old hearth where the flue still drew, coaxing it from a scrap of char cloth and her grandmother's flint. And when it caught and the first thread of smoke went up the ancient chimney and did not choke back into the room, she sat down on her trunk and warmed her split hands and felt something that was not quite hope but was in the same country as it. She went once more to the churchyard that evening to look at the church and to see whether the well by its gate ran clean, and it was there, in the failing light, that the bent old woman found her again. Bet Crozier came out of the yew shadow so quietly that Scrap, at Selina's heel, only lifted his head and did not growl. The old woman stopped very close and looked up into Selina's face with those clouded eyes, and this time the rain had stopped and Selina heard every word. "The hermit was never lonely," Bet Crozier said. "Count the paths." And then she turned and shuffled off between the graves, bent over her blackthorn stick, before Selina could ask her what she meant, or who the hermit had been, or which paths, leaving the words hanging in the wet churchyard air like smoke. Selina walked back up the ruined lane in the dark with the dog trotting ahead, and she lay down that first night in her one swept corner with her shawl over her and the small fire ticking down to embers, and the silence of the wood came in and stood around her, enormous and complete. She was cold and her hands hurt, and she owned a ghost. She did not weep. She lay and listened to the old house settle in the wind, the creak of the beams that still held, and she thought, just before sleep took her, about the old woman's words and about paths, and how a hermit alone in a wood should have made no paths at all. The frost came in the night and stiffened the whole wood, and Selina woke to a world edged in white and to the true size of the task she had set herself. In the clear, cold morning, the ruin looked less like a ghost and more like a job of work, which was better, because a job of work could be broken into days, and days could be got through one at a time. She began with the fallen stone. There was no clever way to do it, there was only lifting. She hauled the fallen slates and the tumbled coping and the moss-slick blocks out of the collapsed eastern room one at a time, and she stacked them by kind, whole here and broken there, the way a mason stacks for reuse, because a stone that has been dressed once is worth keeping. Her hands, which had been a lady's companion's hands, blistered, and then the blisters broke, and then, over the weeks, the skin hardened and the blisters stopped coming. She learned the weight of things. She learned to save her back and use her legs. She learned which beam she could trust to bear her and which would drop her through into the cellar if she asked it to. The village watched, because the village could not help itself. Men going up onto the fell to see to sheep took the long way past the folly to look. Women coming back from the market carried the report of her down into the street. She heard, through Daniel Hode later, the shapes the reports took. First it was that the London joke of a woman would be gone within the week. Then within the month. Then, when the month passed and there was smoke from the folly chimney every morning and a growing stack of sorted stone in the clearing, the reports changed their tone, not to warmth but to a grudging kind of watchfulness, the way you watch a thing that is not doing what you expected. Daniel Hode was the first of them to do more than watch. He was a charcoal burner, a broad, stocky man in his 40s with a short sandy beard and a soot-blackened coat, who worked the coppice in the lower wood and lived most of the year in a turf hut by his smoldering stacks. He came up the lane one gray afternoon pushing a barrow, and in the barrow was a load of dry split ash, and a stack of clean burnt charcoal, and, on top, wrapped in a cloth, half a fresh loaf and a wedge of hard cheese. He did not make a speech of it. He set the barrow down at the edge of her clearing, and tipped the wood out onto the driest ground, and stood a moment with his hands on his hips, looking at her sorted stone. "Green wood'll only sulk at you," he said. "That's ash. It'll burn wet." He nodded at the stone stacks. "You've an eye for it any road." And then he took up his empty barrow and went back down the hill, and that was the whole of it. He had asked her nothing and offered her nothing she could refuse, and he had given her a week of warmth and a day of bread in a way that left her no room to feel like a beggar. She stood looking after him for a long time. Let me stop the story here for just a moment, because I have been wondering as I tell it what you would have done. If a family that owed you shelter had handed you a ruin as a joke and charged you for it, would you have gone and lived in it out of spite, the way Selina did? Or would you have walked away and kept your pride some cleaner way? There is no wrong answer, and I would truly like to read yours below. If you are the kind of person who wants to see how this ends, follow along, because what she found under that floor is the whole reason I am telling you this at all. The Duke came to look, of course. He could not resist it. He rode up the mended lane one bright cold noon with 3 mounted guests behind him, all of them in good coats on good horses, come to be amused by the folly and the fool in it. Selina heard the horses and did not stop what she was doing, which was lifting a coping stone the length of her arm. She set it on its stack, straightened, and turned to face them with lime dust gray on her apron and her hands, and she said nothing. Augustus Thorne sat his horse and looked at her, and looked at the ordered stacks of stone, and looked at the swept threshold and the smoke going up clean from the chimney, and the ready jest died somewhere behind his teeth. His guests waited for him to lead them in the laugh they had ridden up for, and he could not quite find it. There was nothing to laugh at. There was only a young woman in a ruin, filthy and unhurried, watching him with gray eyes that asked for nothing, and the ruin behind her looking, against all sense, a little less like a ruin than it had a fortnight past. "You are industrious, Miss Marsh," he said at last, and it came out sourer than he meant it to. "I have somewhere to be industrious in now," she said. "I thank you for it." He could make nothing of that. He turned his horse and led his guests back down the hill, and one of them said something that made the others laugh, but the Duke did not laugh, and Selina watched the green coat go down into the trees and understood that she had won something small and real, though she could not have said what. It was that same week, kneeling to relay a hearthstone she had knocked loose, that her trained eye caught the thing that would not let her go. The floor of the standing room was flagged in gray Cumbrian slate, wide slabs bedded in mortar, and she had swept and scrubbed most of it clean over the weeks. And on this morning, with the low sun coming level through the empty window and lying flat across the stone, she saw that one stretch of the floor was wrong. The mortar between one set of flags, perhaps 6 of them, in the far corner away from the hearth, was a paler gray than the mortar everywhere else. It was newer. Not new, it was clearly of some age, but newer than the rest by years, set by a different hand, or at a different time, and set well. Someone had lifted these particular flags and put them back down again, and had taken pains to do it properly. She knelt over it for a long while. Then she took the poker and rapped the pale mortared flags and wrapped the flags around them, and where the old floor answered with the dead flat knock of stone on packed earth, the 6 pale flags answered with something else. A hollowness, a held breath under the ground. She thought of the old woman in the churchyard. Count the paths. She sat back on her heels and made herself leave it. Winter was coming down off the fell, and her roof was still half open to the sky, and she had 100 needful things to do before the snow, and a hollow in a floor would keep where a broken roof would not. She told herself this firmly and went back to her work. But it nagged at her through every day that followed, that pale mortar and that held breath under the stone, the way a name you cannot remember nags, and each night she lay in her corner and thought about who lifts a floor with such care, and puts it back so well, and why. She lasted 11 days before she gave in. She chose the 3 coldest days of that early winter, when the ground was iron and no other work could be done, and she took the poker and an old chisel Daniel had left, and a hammer with a loose head, and she set herself to lift the 6 pale flags. It was slow, careful, hurting work. She would not crack the slate if she could help it, because slate that size was worth money she did not have, so she worked the chisel into the mortar joint by joint, and levered a little, and packed the gap, and levered again, and her hands, hard as they had become, split fresh across the knuckles. On the 3rd day the first flag came up. Cold air came out of the gap. But it was not the foul air of a grave or a drain, not the wet rot smell that hung over the rest of the ruin. It was dry. It was cool and dry and clean, with a faint scent under it of dust and dried herbs and old cork, and Selina, kneeling over the black gap with her split hands and her breath smoking, understood at once and completely what that dryness meant. Rot is what neglect leaves behind. Dry, clean air under a sealed floor is not neglect, it is protection. Someone had made this space dry and made it stay dry on purpose, and had sealed it under the stone and gone away. She lifted the other 5 flags in a fever of care, and by the light of her tallow candle lowered into the dark, she saw what was underneath. It was a chamber no more than a large cellar, lined with dry stone and floored with brick, and it was full. Along one wall stood a copper still, its dome green with age but whole, its worm coiled and intact. Beside it, on shelves cut into the rock, were rows of stoneware jars sealed with wax and cork, and small drawers, and bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. She opened one drawer with trembling fingers and found it divided into compartments, and each compartment held seed, dry and whole, labeled in a small brown hand on slips of card. Foxglove, Angelica, Valerian, Elecampane, Feverfew. A whole physic garden, folded down into its seeds and sleeping. And on a broad shelf by itself, wrapped in cloth against the dust, lay 2 books, and she brought them up into the light and opened them there on the cold floor with the candle at her knee, and she did not go to bed that night at all. The first was a herbal. It was thick, its leaves stitched by hand, and it was the life's work of someone who had understood plants the way Selina's grandmother had understood them, only deeper and over more years. Every remedy was written out in that small brown hand, the plant, the part, the season to gather it, the way to prepare it, the dose, and beside many of them a note of what it had done, in whom, and whether it had answered. It was not a book copied out of other books. It was a book made out of a lifetime of watching, and it was worth, to anyone who knew how to read it, more than the whole of Harrowdean Hall. The second book was a ledger. Selina, who had been raised to a ledger, knew what she was holding before she had read a line of it, and when she began to read it, her hands went cold, that had nothing to do with the night. It was ruled in columns in the same brown hand, and it ran across many years, and it was a record of people. A date, a name, a village or a farm, and a word or two for the trouble they had brought. A woman from Sowerby, a lingering cough. A child at Gaskell, burns to the arm, and Selina's eye slid past that line quickly. A shepherd from the high fell, a leg that would not knit. A servant from the hall itself, come by the back way. Page after page after page of them, the sick and the frightened and the poor of a whole quiet corner of Cumberland, who had climbed this ruined lane in the dark for 28 years to knock at a hermit's door, and every one of them written down. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a letter, folded and sealed with a wafer, and on the outside of it, in that same brown hand, was written, "To whoever finds this and does not laugh." She broke the seal. "I am Josiah Fenn," the letter began. "If you are reading this, I am long dead, and you have opened a floor that I sealed with my own hands, and I ask only that you read to the end before you decide what I was." He had been an apothecary, he wrote, in a town to the south, and he had lost his shop and his living when a physician with a grudge and a friend on the bench had ruined him, for the crime, as he put it, of curing the poor cheaper than the physician could. He had come north with nothing, and the old Duke of Harrowdean, the present Duke's grandfather, had been amused to hire a real learned man to sit in his ornamental hermitage in the wood and be a curiosity, a hermit for the entertainment of house guests, paid a few pounds a year and left alone. The world had laughed at that. A learned apothecary made into a garden ornament, a joke to be pointed at from a carriage window. And Josiah Fenn had taken the joke and turned it into the finest cover a healer ever had. "For no one watches a fool," he wrote. "No one asks what the hermit does in his wood at night. They came to me because no one thought me worth the watching. I cleared the old iron spring above the house, the one the Romans knew, and its water builds the blood, and I gave it freely. I grew my physic garden where the ornamental beds had been, and I made my medicines in the still they thought was a curiosity, and for 28 years the people of this county came to my door, and I turned none of them away, and I wrote down every one, so that there should be, somewhere in the world, a record that they had lived and I had tried. I sealed it all beneath the floor when my hands grew too old to work, because I could not bear that it should be thrown out as an old fool's rubbish when I was gone. I would rather it slept in the dark and was found by the right person than that it was burnt by the wrong one. "Count the paths," Fenn had written near the end, and Selina's breath caught. "There should be paths to my door from every direction, worn by 28 years of feet. If they have not grown over, then the county still remembers, and my work is not finished. Give it back to them." Selina sat on the cold brick floor of Ferngarth Hermitage, with the candle burning down, and the 2 books in her lap, and the dog asleep against her side, and she understood at last what she had been given for a shilling. The Duke had thought he was giving her an empty ruin. He had been giving her the busiest door in Cumberland, sealed and sleeping under the stone. The folly had never been empty, it had only been waiting. The storm came 3 nights later, as if the fell had heard her and meant to test whether she was fit to keep what she had found. It came up out of the west after dark, and it was not an ordinary blow. The wind came off the mountains with a sound like the sea, and it got under the half-mended eastern roof that Selina had spent 6 weeks raising, and it took it. She heard the first slates go, and then a beam, and then a whole section of the work she had bled for came down into the ruin in the dark, and the rain drove in through the gap in ropes. She was up and dragging her precious things clear, the 2 books, the seed drawers, wrapping them in oiled cloth and pushing them down into the dry chamber under the floor where nothing had reached them in a lifetime and nothing would reach them now. And the water was running across the flags and the candle was out, and there was nothing to do but hold on and let the fell take back what it wanted. And in the worst of it, in the black, roaring middle of the night, someone knocked at her door. She thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, a fist on the sound wood of the one good door, and a voice under the wind, a man's voice, ragged with cold. She hauled the door open, and the storm came in, and with it 2 people. A man and a woman, soaked to the bone and shaking, who had been on the high road over the pass when the storm broke, and had lost their way and their horse and come down off the fell half dead, following the only light they had seen, which had been her window before the candle drowned. Selina did not think about it. There was nothing to think about. She brought them in and shut the storm out behind them, and she took them to her own corner where the ceiling still held. And she gave them her shawl and her one blanket, and the second blanket she had bought with Daniel's charcoal money. And she stripped the wet things off them and rubbed the woman's blue hands between her own hard ones until the blood came back. She built her fire up with the last of the dry ash Daniel had brought, all of it, not caring that it was all of it, and she gave them the bread she had, which was the end of the loaf, and a hot draught out of her grandmother's book to drive the chill from the marrow. She gave away in one night nearly everything she owned, and she gave it without weighing it, because a house that turns away the lost in a storm is not a house worth keeping, and she meant to keep hers. They sat, the three of them and the dog, through the rest of that wild night in the one dry corner of a half-unroofed ruin, and the strangers slept at last under her blankets, while Selina sat awake by the fire she was feeding with the last of her fuel, watching the water run black across the floor she had opened. And she was colder and poorer at dawn than she had been at dusk, and she had never in her life felt more certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Morning came gray and washed and still. The storm had blown itself out over the eastern fells and left the wood dripping and broken, and Selina stood in her doorway and looked at the ruin of 6 weeks' work, the fallen beam, the gap in the roof, the slates scattered across the clearing. And behind her the two strangers woke warm and fed under her blankets. And the man, when he understood what she had given up for them, a young woman alone with almost nothing, would not stop pressing her hands, and the woman wept. And Selina made them keep the blankets when they went, because they had a long, cold road yet to Penrith, and she had a roof, even a broken one, and they had none. They told it in Penrith, and they told it back along the road, and the story of what had happened up at the Old Folly came down into Nethergill by noon. That she had found something under the floor, that she had taken in strangers in the storm and given them her own bed. The village had been watching her all winter with grudging eyes, and now the eyes changed again, and this time it was not grudging. Daniel Hode came up the hill within the day, and Bet Crozier came behind him, leaning on her blackthorn, slow and bent, to see with her own clouded eyes the thing she had known was there. "Count the paths," the old woman said again, standing over the open floor, and this time she was almost smiling, and Selina understood that Bet Crozier had been a girl in this valley when Josiah Fenn still sat in his wood, and had perhaps once climbed this lane herself in the dark. Word went further than the village. It reached, within the month, an antiquarian and apothecary named Mr. Aldous Pruitt in Kendal, a serious gray man who corresponded with the learned societies, and he rode out on a raw, bright morning to see the find for himself, expecting, he admitted afterward, very little. Selina brought up the 2 books and laid them before him on a plank set over trestles, and he opened the herbal, and he read for a while in silence, and then he sat down rather suddenly on her trunk as though his legs had failed him. He stayed 2 days. He read the herbal cover to cover, and then he read the ledger, all 28 years of it, the 1140 names of it, and when he had finished, he took off his spectacles and pressed his fingers to his eyes. "This is a treasure," he said at last, in the plain, flat voice of a man who does not use the word lightly. "Not for its gold, for there is none. This herbal is the equal of anything in the college libraries, made by a working man out of a lifetime. And this ledger," he put his hand flat on the ledger, "this ledger is the poor of a whole county, written down by the one man who thought them worth writing. There is nothing like it in England that I know of." He looked up at her. "What do you mean to do with it?" And the Duke came too at the last, because he could not help that either. He had heard the story grow in his own village until he could not ride out without hearing Fenn's name. His own grandfather's hermit, the joke of the family, turned somehow into a marvel. He rode up the lane alone this time, without his guests, and he came into the clearing and dismounted and stood over the opened floor, and Selina let him look. She showed him the still and the seed drawers and the herbal, and then she opened the ledger, and she turned it so that he could read it, and she watched his ruddy face as he read down the columns and came, as she had known he would, upon the entries that said, again and again across the years, from the hall. His own household, his own people, his grandfather's people, who had crept down the back way in the dark to a hermit's door because there was nowhere else for them to go, and had been healed and had been written down. Augustus Thorne read for a long time. The flush went out of his cheeks and left them gray. He had given this ruin away as a joke to break a penniless woman, and the ruin had held, all along, the buried proof that his own laughter had been sitting for 50 years on top of the best thing his family ever paid for and never understood. He closed the ledger very carefully, as though it might break, and he stood, and he looked at Selina, and there was nothing at all he could say that would not make him smaller. So he said nothing. He put on his hat, and he went out to his horse, and he rode back down the lane, and he did not come again. There was no shouting. There was no reckoning demanded, and none paid. There was only a proud man who had been shown a truth he could not argue with, riding home in silence with it, and that was punishment enough, and Selina wanted no more. Mr. Pruitt offered to buy it. The societies would pay, he said, and pay well, for the herbal and the ledger both, and she could leave the cold ruin and the broken roof and live decently on the money for years. Selina thanked him and refused. She had thought about it in the nights, and she had read Fenn's letter over until she knew it by heart, and she knew what he had asked. Give it back to them. Not sell it to a society in a glass case in London, where no farm woman with a coughing husband would ever climb the stairs to reach it. Give it back. So she kept it. She spent that year not making herself rich, but making the Hermitage whole. Not grand, only whole. Mending the roof with Daniel's help, and the help, now, of half the village, who came up the lane with their own hands and their own slate, because the woman up at the Folly had kept their forgotten healer's work and given strangers her bed in the storm. She cleared the iron spring above the house that Fenn had cleared before her, the chalybeate water the Romans knew, and she let it run into a stone trough by the path where anyone could drink. She dug the physic garden back out of the wild, and she sowed Fenn's sleeping seeds, the foxglove and the angelica and the valerian and the feverfew, and in the spring they came up out of the dark ground where they had waited, as though they had only been holding their breath. And the people came back. That was the thing that undid her, the first time it happened. A woman walked up the lane one April morning with a child on her hip, shy and half afraid, and asked, was it true? Was there someone up at the old place again who knew about the herbs? And Selina, with her grandmother's book and Fenn's book both open on her table, said yes. There was. Bet Crozier lived to see the first of the queue and died quiet in her bed that summer. And they said in the village she went content. Daniel Hode mended the garden wall and never made a speech about any of it. And Scrap grew fat and slept in the sun on the mended threshold like a thing that had always owned it. One evening near the end of that first year, Daniel found Selina standing at the head of the lane, looking down at the path, which was worn now, worn broad and bare again by feet coming up out of the valley, the paths growing back that Bet Crozier had told her to count. He stood beside her a while in the way he had, saying nothing, and then he said it was a strange thing, all of it, that a man could sit in a wood for near 30 years as a joke and turn out to have been the making of the whole valley. He didn't sit here to be laughed at, Selina said, watching the path. He sat here to be found. She did not explain it, and Daniel did not ask her to, and after a while he went off down the hill to his charcoal, and she went in to her books. A year to the day after a duke had handed her a ruin for a shilling to break her, Selina Marsh stood in the doorway of Ferngarth Hermitage and watched a queue of ordinary people wind down the woodland path to her door, come up out of the fells with their coughs and their burns and their sleepless children and their small hurts, the way they had come for 28 years to another door on the same spot, in the same wood, up the same lane. The village that had watched her behind lace curtains now spoke her name in the street and called her, without anyone deciding to, the keeper of Ferngarth. She had not become rich. She had refused rich. She had become the steward of a thing that a proud family had thrown away twice and never once understood, and she meant to hand it on, when her own hands grew too old, sealed or open, to the next one worthy of it. Josiah Fenn's herbal healed the sick of that valley for the rest of the century, and his ledger of 1,140 forgotten names sits to this day, they say, in a case in the mended Hermitage, where any farm wife who can read may go and find her own grandmother written down in a hermit's careful brown hand, proof that she had lived, and that someone had thought her worth the counting. That is what endured. Not the joke, and not the duke, whose name the valley soon enough forgot. What endured was a worn path through a wood, and a spring running clean into a stone trough, and a young woman who had been given a ghost for a shilling and chose, instead of leaving, to stay and tend it. Thank you for sitting with me all the way to the end of Selina's story. This tale of a ruin and a joke, and the busiest door in Cumberland found sleeping under a floor. If it moved you, a like helps more people find it, and I would be glad to have you subscribe and come with me to the next one. Before you go, tell me this in the comments. What forgotten place in your own life, a person, a skill, a corner of a house, is quietly waiting for someone to stop laughing at it and start tending it? I will be reading. Until the next story, keep well and mind the paths you leave behind you.